Hello, everyone. My name is Luca Somigli. I am the chair of the Department of Italian Studies and the Goggio chair in Italian Studies, and it is my pleasure to welcome all of you here in person or on our YouTube channel to the third and unfortunately last lecture by our Goggio professor Margherita Ganeri, the third in a series of lectures under the rubric of memory and trauma that has taken us first to Sicily with Il Gatto Pardo, then last week to Italian American literature with Helen Barolini, and today takes us to Canada. Few words of introduction of our speaker tonight. Margherita Ganeri, as I mentioned, has been here now for a few weeks as a Goggio professor, is a full professor of contemporary Italian literature at the University of Calabria, where she's also the founding director of the Seminar Italian Diaspora Studies. She's on the board of director of the journal Moderna and directs the book series Italian Diaspora Studies for the publisher Rubbettino. She has received 2 Fulbright fellowships and has been appointed visiting professor to numerous universities across the world, Cambridge, Stony Brook University, and Stony Brook Fordham in the University of Chicago in the US, and here in Canada, the University of Saskatchewan, and of course, U of T. She has published widely on many aspects of modern Italian literature. Among her 10 author books, I should mention at least Il romanzo storico in Italia, Il dibattito critico dall'origine al postmoderno, published in 1999, monographs on Pirandello romanziere of 2001, and Federico De Roberto, L'Europa in Sicilia, saggi su Federico De Roberto, 2005, as well as on Italian American literature, specifically Italian America, epos and storytelling in Helen Barolini. Her most recent book is Ritagli critici sulla letteratura italiana contemporanea that just came out last year. The title of her, before I say the title of her paper today, I would like to thank her again, since this, as I said, is her last lecture, to thank her again for this series of lectures, which has been really the highlight of our term. So thank you for being here with us. And with no further ado, Memory, Trauma, and Calabria in Italian Canadian Literature, a tribute to Penny Petrone. Margherita Ganeri. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Luca. Thank you, Luca, for this wonderful presentation. Thank you, everybody, for being here. And I have to sit because I have to operate my PowerPoint here. So you can see from the first slide on my back here, the woman in the picture is Penny Petrone. I'm going to dedicate today my lecture to her work, a tribute to Penny Petrone. I think she's a very important and interesting writer, and unfortunately, she's not recognized, at least not in Italy. But I have the impression that after first maybe a few years of acknowledgements here in Canada, my impression is from far away from Italy that her figure today in the debate and within the Italian Canadian literature, she is not very central. She is forgotten. She needs to be reproposed to the public. This is why I propose her today. And as you can see here in the first slide, she was born in 1925. I'll get back to that later. But before, I would like to acknowledge the land in which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of many Indigenous people, and I am grateful to have the opportunity to be a guest and to work today on this land. Now, I would like to start with a very fast and general look at the topic of Italian Canadians, because of course the debate and the general knowledge, general awareness about what does it mean, Italian Canadian, Italian Canadians is strong in Canada, and of course it has to be. And the first publications are started in the 60s. However, the debate on Italian Canadian literature is a part of this more general, more wider discourse on Italian Canadians, but as a specific story that is more marginal and more limited to the number of people that are interested in that in comparison with the public discourse on Italian Canadians. And I prefer to use the form Italian diaspora literature in Canada. I will not go into that today because I did in the previous lecture, but you have the pictures of the two books. One is the Moderna Italian Diaspora Studies issue. The other one is the book by Donna Gabaccia, Italy, Many Diasporas, that explain why I prefer to use the formula Italian diaspora instead of Italian Canadian. If some of you were not here in the previous lecture and is interested to talk about that, we can have time after. But I don't have time to deal into that now. So I will start with the first quotation of Joseph Pivato, and this very important article, historical article, documenting Italian-Canadian writing, a bibliography, that was published on the first issue of the journal Italian Canadiana. The first issue is in 1985. He wrote, Italian Canadian literature did not exist as an identifiable entity before 1978. Two books were published that year that produced a shock of recognition. And one is the Italians by Frank Pacci. The other one, of course, is the anthology Roman Candle, edited by Pier Giorgio Di Cicco. So 1978, according to Pivato, is the first year. Before that, we had no traces of Italian-Canadian literature. Then the important first National Conference of Italian-Canadian Writers took place in Vancouver in 1986, and that was the same year. During that conference, there was the establishment, the foundation of the Italian-Canadian Writers Association. You have the logo over there. Then you have the book published out of that conference, Writers in Transition, 1990, and then another anthology came out in the 1983. So in the 70s, late 70s, the first acknowledgement, the first recognition of this field, then everything else that happened was later in the 80s. Since the 80s, though, the field has grown a lot. And according to Francesco Loriggio, today Italian-Canadian literature can be defined as an emerging literature. And it's emerging, in my point of view, quoting Loriggio, because it poses at least two crucial questions. The first one, and this is central in Loriggio criticism in all his critical works on Italian-Canadian literature, it deals with these two questions. The first one is, what are the relations between the various Italies outside of Italy? Between Italian-Canadian, Italian-American, Italian-Australian, Italian-German, and so on. And the second one is, by which critical work, what is the connection that Italies outside of Italy can be integrated to Italian cultural history? I think these two questions are very important because they characterize the theoretical field, the critical field of Italian-Canadian studies in comparison with the others, and especially the Italian-American one. I think it's very important to notice, to promote, to understand the importance of this sort of comparative approach that scholars, critics like Loriggio pursue when they deal, on the specific field. They compare what happens in Canada with what happens in the United States and so on. And this is something that doesn't happen until very recently in the other Italian diasporic literatures outside of Canada. But then the second very important point, of course, my positionality, I'm in Italy, I work in Italy, I study the Italian diaspora literature from Italy. So of course, I appreciate very much this perspective. What is the connection with Italy? What are the interactions with Italy, the consequences? How can be integrated this literature to Italian cultural histories? And I think the Italian-Canadian literature is an emerging literature that is growing and will grow exactly because it has this world vision and the sense of a stronger connection with Italy. And in fact, I think maybe a little bit provoking this slide, I think the growing body of Italian-Canadian literature goes very much with the growing bond with Calabria, but also with the University of Calabria. There are so many initiatives that were promoted in this field at the University of Calabria in the last years. For example, the big conference on 150 years celebration of the Foundation of Canada, the Festival of Accenti 2023. All these books were published, many of them in the Italian Diaspora Studies series with Editore Rubbettino, the anthology co-edited by Vito Teti and Loriggio, A Filo Doppio. So, and also the book by Vito Teti, translated recently into English, Stones of Bread. Those are all initiatives that that show a very strong interaction between Italian-Canadian literature and what in Italy it's studied, how this literature is perceived and how it's enlarged in Italy, and the importance of the bond. Now, a very short overview of the Italian, the Italian diaspora literature in Canada. There are some established authors, and one of them, I'm very happy she's here with us. And if you can look, I've just chose 8 because I didn't have this much space. But if you can see, the older one were born in the 40s and second part of the 40s. However, even though there is a very large Calabrese community here in Canada, according to Joseph Pivato, again in this, as published in 2005, the diasporic Calabrian writers were not very many. I mean, Antonio Correa, Antonino Mazza, or Peter Oliva, but also she writes, and there is a quote in the slide, that all of the Canadian writers of Calabrian background, there is only one woman in 2005. And the woman he talks about is Darlene Madot. It's one of the 12 women interviewed in this fantastic documentary, Invisible Voices, a spotlight on Italian Canadian women writers, where I found other 2 Calabrese women, Gina Valle and Giovanna Riccio, and other 2 Calabrese I wanted to add to the list, Connie Guzzo-McFarland and Rosanna Michelotti Battigelli. So the thing is that even the regional Italian-Canadian literature is probably growing. It's a matter of recognizing the writers that haven't been recognized. But there are some writers that just started publishing in the last 10 to 12 years that are actually very interesting, very important. This was a very short overview for those of you not very familiar with the field. But of course, Penny Petrone, as I said before, was born much earlier. She was born in 1925. So she is the generation that before the current, a more visible, to quote the invisible women. So Penny Petrone Calabria's heritage. Father Luigi Petrone emigrated from Aprigliano, a very small town, provincia di Cosenza, in 1900 at the age of 11 years. He returned to Calabria after 10 years to serve as a military in the Libyan War, and then he decided to return to Port Arthur in 1912. Port Arthur is the name, today is Thunder Bay. Her mother, Luisa Cisco, emigrated from Pianecrati, an even smaller town in Calabria, when she was 23 years old. Here on the map you can locate the two towns, Aprigliano and Pianecrati, provincia di Cosenza. And Pianecrati has a big title. The title of this is the smallest town in Calabria. It's the smallest among the 409 municipalities in Calabria. So this is a record because all the towns are small, but Pianecrati is the smallest. Another very short, flash on something I'm not going to talk about is Calabrians in Thunder Bay. We were talking before that. There are a lot of Calabrians, especially from this area, Provincia di Cosenza, in Thunder Bay. And John Potestio in this book claims that the largest immigrant community of Grimaldesi, people coming from Grimaldi, another town close by, anywhere in the world was in Thunder Bay. And there are reasons for it, economical reasons. But what I'm saying, Penny Petrone family, that moved to Thunder Bay, Port Arthur at that time, they were members of a very large Calabrian community in that area. Now, Penny Petrone, focus only on her. She is a very multifaceted personality. She had lots of different professions, multiple professions. She was a very passionate teacher who taught from the elementary school to the university college in very different contexts, not only in Canada, but everywhere in the world. Especially, she spent years teaching in rural areas in Uganda, in Africa, then moved to South America. She preferred to go to teach in areas that were underdeveloped, as she writes, third world areas. She was also a scholar, as we will see in a moment. She was an archivist, a very serious one, and ahead of time, journalist, philanthropist. She raised money for the educational institutions both in Africa and in Thunder Bay. And she was a social activist, feminist, and a writer, of course. She started her teaching in this one-room rural school in the Onion Lake Road, where she developed her interest for the indigenous children, indigenous students, that later on she transformed into a very important research project that she carried on for three books, we will see in a moment. She started traveling in 1952, again, ahead of time. At that time, not very many women would travel alone. There's a quotation from her second memoir, Embracing Serafina. I circled the globe. I traveled 7 continents, 7 seas, 80 countries, and 1 million miles or more. Then she came back, also because she had breast cancer, so for a few years she couldn't travel anymore. So she came back and she went enrolled at the University of Alberta, where she received a doctorate in English literature in 1977. But she was a very accomplished person. She received lots of honors, if you could see there, medals, honors, especially for these fundraising activities. She collected a couple of millions of dollars for fellowships in there. And in fact, after she died, the Magnus Theatre was nominated, Dr. Penny Petrone Center for the Performing Arts. That's that. Her first publications were on Isabella Valency Crawford. As you can see, this is the first collection of stories. Was published before she finished her PhD, 1975. The second one, The Fairy Tales, in 77, so the year she finished her PhD. She dedicated her doctoral dissertation to this figure, to this poet and narrator. And this is what she writes in Embracing Serafina, Canadian Literature in 1979. During the discussion, the first week of classes, on whether or not there was any such thing as Canadian literature, they told me that Canadians had a colonial mentality and an inferior complex. We didn't even know whether a Canadian literature existed. I knew that Canadian literature as subject was relatively unknown. But except for a 2-week course on Canadian literature at the University of Ottawa and a few Canadian writers I had lectured on, I did not know the history of Canadian literature. So this is why she chose, in a memoir she writes, on the last day I could change my, topic. She chose to specialize, to do a dissertation on Canadian literature. And then finally, she decided to publish on Isabel Crawford. But later on, a few years later, before even finishing her PhD, she started her research on indigenous literature. So in 1975, the Faculty of Education at Lakehead University started the Native Teachers Education Program. Because of my travels throughout the Third World, as I said, she started traveling in 1952, I was seeing connection between the oppressed people there and the native peoples of Canada. I felt that what they needed was to have their literature, so long unknown and recognized. I wrote over 200 letters to museums and historical societies across Canada. Many replied that there was no such literature. This response did not deter me. From 1975 to 1982, I traveled across Canada to archives, museums, and several reservations, trying to unearth this forgotten and buried material. It was a labor of love. And so she published these 3 very important books. The first one, First People, First Voices, came out in 1983. The second one, which is actually the first comprehensive collection of mostly oral literature pieces of Native in Canada, came out in 1990. And then later, the third book is dedicated it's a collection of stories from the Inuit. This is also the first one that was ever published, the first collection ever published. For these books, Penny was made an honorary chief by the Gold Bay Ojibwe, which is a very important accomplishment in my point of view. So she started writing about her Italian heritage after all this. So I hope that for what I've said, what I've said it's enough to understand what type of intellectual was Penny Petrone. She was a pioneering figure, interested into researching things that were denied. The existence of these things were denied. So Canadian literature, when nobody believed there was a Canadian literature. Indigenous literature, when people said that there's no such literature. However, even though she's first generation Italian, her parents emigrated, as I said before, she never wasn't interested into her personal Italian heritage. She started very late. After all that, as a consequence of all that, and also as a consequence of all her travels in third world countries, and not only, we will see in a minute. So then she finally published a first memoir in 1995, the second one in 2000. The third one was published posthumous, but it is not about her Italian heritage. So the first two, Breaking the Mold and Embracing Serafina, are dedicated to her heritage. So how did she start? This is also for me very interesting. I had been reluctant to join the group, and the group is the International Conference of Women of Italian Ancestry. This conference was organized by the National Organization of Italian American Women in Italy in 1990. There was even a scheduled audience with the Pope during the conference. So she was invited, but she didn't want to go at the beginning. So I had been reluctant to do it because I had been embarrassed by Italianness. But this trip proved to be an important decision in my life. Never before I'd met so many intelligent, dynamic, attractive, and successful women of Italian descent. Their personal life stories resembled mine. But also she meets the writers. I was surprised at the number of personal histories Italian-American had written. For example, Pietro Di Donato's Christ in Concrete, Jerry Manjone's Mount Allegro, and Helen Barolini, Umbertina. In another passage of the memoir, she writes that it was exactly the reading of Umbertina that stimulated, pushed her into writing her memoir. And in fact, I must say that the influence of the Umbertina, you can really perceive it. You know, it's shown in the book. And then the surprise also about the history of Italian immigrants in the great bastion of freedom and democracy before and during World War I had been even more horrific than in my British Dominion from sea to sea. And more, the women encouraged me to tell me my own story. And so it was on this trip that the seeds for breaking the mold were planted. So it was a feminine, a sorellanza, you know, this sense of belonging to a group of women that started pushing her into writing. So this is the beginning, the first page of Breaking the Mold. First of all, I want to say that the title is very idiomatic, this expression, breaking the mold. And in fact, the translation that was published in Italy, Il modello in frantumi, the title in the translation in Italy doesn't make sense really, and it's not appropriate. Modello in frantumi in Italian doesn't have a meaning really. So the idea of the mold as a whole that is broken by her evokes so many, you know, it contains so many semantical different possible interpretation meanings. There is the sense of the mold is the entire that is broken. And so in this sense, the entire is a Calabrian or Italian or Calabrian culture that has to be broken. But also it contains the sense of being queer, going against, you know, pattern that has been established before. So there is a problem with the translation. This is one. In fact, the Italian translation wasn't successful at all. This book now, you cannot find it anywhere. Besides, it was a minor publisher, but the translation itself, not only the title, is not professionally well done. And this is a shame. But anyway, in this first memoir, Penny tells the story of her childhood since she was born, as we see in this first page, until she was 20 years old. And she starts from her name, which is a very important point in her production. There was great rejoicing in the home of Luigi Luisa Petrone on the day I was born. It was a long-awaited arrival. In fact, Daddy had begun to despair that Mama was barren. But after 2 years of marriage with a special intersection of the science and the help of a midwife, she delivered in her big breastbed. I was named Serafina and affectionately called Serafinella. Daddy named me after his mother, and there was no other names given me. Eventually, I rejected the name. I should have been honored. So this is a very important theme that keeps coming back and forth in all her memoirs. She decided to change her name, Penny, instead of Serafina, because she refused her Italian heritage. This memoir, the first memoir, they're both very interesting, but the first memoir really contains a very detailed reconstruction of the conditions of life in Thunder Bay of this family in the early 30s. It's a source of documentation that, in my point of view, is really compelling. But it also contains a very interesting portrayals of the typical Italian family. In this page, you can see that the story, you can read the story of the mother of Luigi, and in this figure of the mother who was very strong, you can see the influence of the model of Umbertina that we saw the other time. But anyway, what is important in that the father is a betrayal of the family pattern. As I said before, he went back to Italy to participate in was a military in the Libyan War, but then at the end, her mother, Serafina, wanted him to stay. The widow Serafina expected Luigi to settle into the family expanding business endeavor. Although cash was scarce, the farm was beginning to flourish. It was the first in the Marchesato Crotonete region to use agricultural machinery. But the restless bachelor was determined to return to North America, even though he knew firsthand that Canada was not the promised land with golden streets. So the mother insisted him, even at the train station, crying, begging him to stay, and he pushed her away, and she falls there on the floor. So this is defined in the text as an assault on parental authority. So the father portrays an assault on parental authority, one of the cornerstones of the centuries, old Calabrian peasants' feudal culture. And this was seen as a glaring example of the New World disastrous influence. To defy a mother pleas and willful abandon one's family in a society where long years of regional isolation made the family sacrosanct simply wasn't done. His mother and family were horrified. But it's Penny's mother, the character that's really important for her development. Louisa had wanted to be a nun, but she was destined to be a wife. Now, she wanted to be a nun. She was a very religious woman. And her religion is stocked with folk wisdom, popular wisdom from Calabria. So the way she transmit a peculiar religion wit to the daughters is very important for the development of Penny, who will stay a very religious person until the end of her life. On the other hand, her mother brings with her lots of things from Calabria: corredo da cucina, corredo da letto, the queen size coperta matrimoniale, and then this mention to the Notte Felice. But as I said before, it's mostly her religious view that it's important. The mother talks with proverbs, and these proverbs are very often in dialect. Some are in Italian, some other in dialect. This memoir, much more than the second one, is patched with Italians. There is a very strong level of interculture. The book is in English, but there is a lot of Italian sentences, proverbs, words, and many of them are not written properly because the writer remembers them from the orality. And so she remembers them because, she's writing this in the 90s. So she transcribed them with many mistakes. But those mistakes are due to the pronunciation that she remembers in the memory. So La Mamma would say, God bless you, but also proverbs that I've never heard. I've seen it before. Only Luisa uses them, like, Beato il latte che t'ha dato mammata, bless the milk that your mother gave you on. Or even, Beato le minne che ti hanno allattato. I've never heard of this. Bless the breeds that suckled you. So she was probably a very creative also woman. Probably some of these programs she would make up. And then you see the other quote, tutto il mondo è paese, the world is one village, a notion that would be popularized by Marshall McLuhan reassured them. So the fatalismo, they had la volontà di Dio, no? God's will, was their destiny. The Calabrese perceived il destino as the underpinning of life itself. To deny this awful force with predetermination, which predetermines the fate of mortals, is to court disaster. So this is the destiny, and this destiny is God's will, and there's nothing else you can do. This is another example of Italian words that were remembered by Penny in the orality. But the words are also part of the Calabrian culture. Mamma would scream such Calabrese expletives as Saraceno. That's very, terms of abuse dating back to the time when the Saracens orders conquered Calabria. Well, they never did, but they were dangerous. And other insults, such as facitosta, the real word is facciatosta, scostamata, scostumata, disgraziata is not written like that. In my child arrogance, I was embarrassed more by her high-pitched foreign voice than by what she was saying. But the truth is, she remembers very well all these words. She grew up in a very strong Calabrian cultural environment. Other examples of proverbs. Chi sputa il cielo in faccia ritorna. Don't spit in the wind because it can hit you in the face. Dicemi con chi ne stai che ti dico chi ne sei, this dialect. Tell me you go to with and I'll tell you who you are. A lingua non ossa ma osse taglia. This is totally misunderstood the way it's written. The tongue has no bone, but it can cut bones. Now, from the frequency, from the quantity of these proverbs, these words, this expression, you can see how strong was the Calabrese context, the Italian context in this family and in the neighborhood. This is a very important point to understand the denial that Penny Petrone did. And there is a difference, for example, with Alan Barolini. We don't have that frequency of expressions in Italian or in dialect because Alan Barolini was second generation, not first generation. And this is so important sociologically, linguistically to study these writers. But the contiguity makes it even more interesting, her denial, her rejection of her Italianness in this part. When she writes the memoir in the early 90s, however, going back with memory, she judges differently. Although I accused Mama of being old-fashioned, she was, as I think back today, ahead of time. Canada was changing her. There has always been the tendency in Calabrese culture to dote on sons, but I never felt that Mama did this, nor did she put pressure on her girls to get married. I doubt that she approved the conventional ambasciata, and she never expected me to participate in the passeggiata, a ritual whereby young women display themselves by strolling out. And also the mother, she's allowed to wear pantaloons and stuff. So thinking back in time, her mother was not as old-fashioned as she remembered. But nonetheless, as anticipated, she rejects it. This is a traumatic denial. I tried hard to erase the Italianness that the dominant culture despised. I tried to determine just what made me so foreign. Was it my name, my appearance, my skin color, my breath, my body smell, my food, the language I spoke? See, all these questions make you understand how painful and traumatic was for her to feel different from the other. I couldn't change my color. I refused to eat food with garlic and strong flavors. I was very conscious of yaw and bad breath. I had a very good command of the English language, and I spoke it without an Italian accent. In my assimilation is horrid. Now, this is a quote, it's a quote from Bertina. Assimilation is horrid. I cried with embarrassment when the mama screamed at the top of their voice, as we said. I was certain the English people did none of those things. And so the decision. At 17, I renamed myself Penny Petrone. Mama steadfastly refused to call me Penny, poor woman. And I was still Serafina, but in larger word, I gradually became known as Penny Petrone. Finally, I graduated, leaving the WASP stronghold forever. So, as I said before, Breaking the Mold ends she is 20. So 3 years after she changes her name. So the second memoir, Embracing Serafina, the title itself is meaningful, goes back to this story that is told in Breaking the Mold also, but he analyzes, he presented also in a light of a different awareness. They came back later. She defines that as an odyssey that she didn't know she was going through. And this odyssey will end in Calabria. And I put in this slide the index of the novel to show how much she traveled. She went to the Orient, the Middle East, the tropics, the New World, Africa, China, Great Britain, Italy, Germany, Italy again and again, and then Calabria is the final destination, as you can see. And some of those trips would last years. In many of those trips, she would stay and teach. It wasn't like tourism, going there, back and go for 2 days. So it's interesting, and you can see just already from the index, the final goal, the goal of all this, the final destination is Calabria. So I call it Calabria is the return to the source that brings healing in her. So this is the beginning. Okay, Embracing Serafina is dedicated to Calabria, as you can see. And this is the introduction, the beginning of the introduction, the road to now. She goes back, in 1995, I published Breaking the Mold, my memoir that tells what it was like growing up in Port Arthur as the daughter of Italian immigrants, pulled in one direction by my parents' insistence of old world tradition, and in the opposite direction by a dominant society that was xenophobic and WASP, a term I did not know then. For all their wisdom, my parents were blissful, unaware of my dilemma. In my desire to fit and feel more accepted in the mainstream society of the city I was born in, I discarded my Italian name, Serafina, which I abhorred, and called myself Penny. I was 17. I did not resolve the question in Breaking the Mold. My memoir ended when I was 20, my second year. What questions she didn't solve? If I go back, she didn't solve the question of her personal identity problem that is related with this assimilation paradigm. The assimilation is Ari. I go back to the second paragraph here. By this time, I had become truly assimilated and deeply devoted to British traditions, British royalty, and the British Empire. I love the cadences of hypnotic rhythms of Churchill's speeches, and I admired English courage during Battle of Britain. Never once did I question the rightness of colonization and my unexamined assimilation. I was English. I loved my new English name, Penny. So what's the problem here? The problem is that assimilation and colonization. At this time, until she was 20, she refused her name. She refused her Italian heritage because she was a victim of the assimilation process. She was colonized. She couldn't solve the problem. But this problem was still alive inside of herself. So even though she wrote that memoir after dealing, as I said before, with Canadian literature and with indigenous literature, she still could not solve her problem in the first memoir. And in my philosophy of education courses, I taught that the ancient Greek philosophers, Socrates, had said that the unexamined life is not worth living. I've also read somewhere the knowledge of self is a lifetime job. It has taken me 4 years after writing Breaking the Mold to reflect on the motives that prompted my lifetime in travel. Looking back, I now realize that I had been pursuing some end, intangible, and largely inarticulate, arbitrarily summed up in notions of fun, adventure, romance. The problem is that she was looking for something inside herself. She was looking outside for something that she was hidden inside herself. I was trying to discover at the same time, trying to escape. I'm finally forced to expose something I've always hidden from myself, the Serafina within the penny. Paradoxically, the very being I was avoiding was the very being I was trying to find in my foreign lands, struggling within and against the captivity. So this is why she ends up in Calabria. Now, of course, things are coming clear. She was escaping Serafina and traveling in the world, but couldn't solve the problem until she had an epiphany, what she calls an epiphany, a pretty strong word. My epiphany took place in 1977 in my mother's hometown in Piane Crati in southern Italy, at a ceremony making me an honorary citizen of the town. I was finally able to exorcise the hatred so deeply rooted in my psyche for my Italian name, Serafina, and to accept my true identity. Embracing Serafina tells the story of this quest from my true identity. And it taken me half a century to recognize the truth. I'm both Serafina and Penny. So the last part of the novel is dedicated to, of course, to this, the telling of this epiphany. But before, there is a detailed report of what happened before. So she went to Calabria one time in 1952. That time, she went to Aprigliano, her father town, and she didn't like it. I found the somber pessimism and the stagnant economy of the region unnerving. I stopped counting the number of marriage proposals I received. It seemed that every young man wanted to come to America. After 3 days, I was anxious to leave. I was unable and unwilling at that time to identify with my Calabrese ancestry. So she left. The epiphany is much later, 1997. In this second trip, much later, she has, because the trip was mediated by professors at the University of Calabria, because she became famous before of the publication on indigenous studies. So she was recognized in Italy. She was invited for conferences, and especially in Calabria. Cesare Pitto, Professor Cesare Pitto is very often quoted here, but he wasn't the only one. So it's very interesting that she changed totally perspective on the south of Italy before arriving to that specific moment that she calls epiphany in Piane Crati. So not only was I beginning to accept my name, but was also becoming enamored of southern Italy as a region maligned by the north as backward and primitive. There's even a political party whose mandate is to separate from the south, of course, La Lega at that. Southerners even today have great difficulty finding accommodation in Turin. At home, too, was an Italianist associated with loudness and vulgarity, but I found respect and decorum, remarkable dignity and great courtesy everywhere, as well as the legacies of 2,500-year history, medieval castle, monasteries, unto the ruins, and so and so and so. And even great art in obscure churches and museums. So she started to appreciate Calabria, the South in general, for the rich cultural heritage, but also for the courtesy of the people. So she started questioning a commonplace that sees the south dirty, inferior to the north. But again, this is the story of the Epiphany. And we're going to go into that because it's a very important part. But it was the ceremony sponsored by the Amministrazione Comunale di Pianecrati in collaboration with the University of Calabria, which made an honorary citizen of Pianecrati, my mother built in Calabria, that made me less ambivalent about my Italian identity and enabled me to accept the reality of my being Italian. The modern University of Calabria, an Italian rarity located in Rente, a suburb of Cosenza, was founded in Astoria in 1960. And I want to underline the connection that I had before, anticipated with the slide connection. In her case, the bond with the University of Calabria was vital, as I said before. So vital, important to define the end of an odyssey. Without that, probably we wouldn't have this memoir or this last part of the memoir. So we will see what happens here. So the room was full of people. They arrived late because there had been problems on the road. But still, she said, when we arrived, there is more than 100 people waiting for us. There is a local TV, people with flowers. So she felt really good in that. So Cesare Pitto introduced me. The room was suddenly quiet. I rose, deeply touched by the tributes and the outpouring of love around me. I was choked up and struggled to keep back tears. I read my prepared address in halting Italian. The entire room rose as one body, clapping and cheering. Relatives started to introduce themselves. I didn't know how I was related to them. It didn't matter. They were Petrones from Apirigliano, my father's hometown, a few kilometers away from my mother's, who were giving me the gift of their love, and I was happy to give them mine embrace. Citrino, another guy, opened the ceremony to the public for questions. Why did you change your name to Penny? What's the significance of the title of your book, Breaking the Mold? Do you consider yourself Italian or Canadian? I answered in English, throughout ashamed of myself because I could not speak Italian fluently. Professor Walter Temellini translated for me. The numerous questions provoked lively discussion. In the end, Flavio Giacomantonio, a writer who had translated Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, declared that I may have broken the mold, but that the mold was whole again with my return to my ancestral roots. You are like the prodigal son, he said. There was a burst of applause. Never before had I felt so cherished. Never before had so much affection had been lavished upon me. Tears welled in my eyes. Right then, I was living the greatest moment of my life. They called me Serafina, and I did not mind. For the first time in my life, I was proud of my Italian name. My personal odyssey had ended. My lifelong struggle with my name had been exorcised. I'm now in peace with myself, and my Italian heritage finally claimed me. So this is the ending of the memoir. It's a very moving passage, and it's a passage that very often I present to the students in classrooms in Italy, and it's very interesting to me when we do that in Calabria, in Italy, students laugh. And I ask, why do you laugh? Who cares about Pianecrati, they say. There is nothing there. Pianecrati is nowhere. It's so small that nobody knows where there is. And I actually think that this reaction from people in that area, it's very interesting, because you may not understand why for her it's so important. The epiphany happens there, and it's so important, such an important recognition. so much that she solved her internal odyssey and problem in pianocracy. And at the same time, for other people, pianocracy is nothing. I leave with that question. Thank you.